On September 30th, 2021, Sony Interactive Entertainment announced that it had acquired Bluepoint Games, officially welcoming the studio into the PlayStation Studios family. Now, Bluepoint Games was not just any studio. They were coasting off of two incredibly successful remakes, those being Shadow of the Colossus and the Demon's Souls remake. The Demon's Souls remake was one of the crown jewels of the PlayStation 5 launch lineup, and many believe that this remake alone had justified Sony purchasing them. Fast forward to February 19th, 2026. Employees at Bluepoint are being told that their studio is shutting down. Their in-development project, reportedly titled Project Black Fang, is cancelled. And by March 2nd, 2026, Bluepoint Games will be gone. Now this is interesting, because throughout the entire studio's life, Bluepoint had not shipped out any game that would have indicated to Sony to shut down their studio. In fact, during their 5 years under Sony, Bluepoint didn't release anything at all aside from support work on God of War Ragnarok. So why shut them down? Was this Bluepoint's fault? Or was this the result of Sony's obsession with live service games, an obsession that has now claimed multiple prominent studios' lives? Because Bluepoint isn't alone. Firewalk Studios was shut down shortly after Concord released and failed. Neon Koi originally was acquired for mobile gaming ambitions and was later dissolved. And now Bungie, a legendary studio that is now reduced to less than 50% of their staff, is forced to stop updates and maintenance on Destiny 2, and the remaining IP Marathon has lost over 90% of its player base since launch earlier this year. Over and over again, Sony acquires a studio, shifts its direction towards live service, and then closes it when the gamble doesn't pay off. In this video, we're breaking down Sony's live service strategy, the pattern behind these studio closures, and whether PlayStation's future is headed towards collapse. My name is McBoneless, and welcome to Sony, the bane of live service. On May 26, 2022, Sony shared an investor relations presentation that revealed that Sony Interactive Entertainment planned to have 12 PlayStation Live service games by the end of fiscal year 2025. Sony leveraged both Bungie and Haven Studios as live service developers. Bungie specifically was noteworthy as for the past 8 years they had shown financial success with Destiny and Destiny 2 respectively. In fact, the primary reason for Bungie's acquisition was so that they would be able to share their live service expertise to Sony and their other acquired studios. By 2025, Sony wanted 55% of their PS5 investment to be live service, and 45% to traditional single-player games. It is clear that Sony was wanting to aggressively invest in the live service market. They had the dollar signs in their eyes, and they saw the potential of live service games, and how they could bring so much more money than a single-player game. But what they didn't see was the risk, because as we all know too well these days, not all live service games remain live. On April 20th, 2023, Sony Interactive Entertainment announced that they had formed an agreement with Probably Monsters Incorporated to acquire Firewalk Studios, which at the time was currently in the works of a AAA multiplayer game for the PS5 and PC. Probably Monsters is an independent AAA video game company that was founded in 2016 by Harold Ryan, a former CEO and president of Bungie. Their company's mission statement is to, quote, change the way games are made by delivering industry-defining games within a healthy work culture, unquote. Now, what was that AAA multiplayer game that Firewalk Studios was working on? Well, it is of course none other than
the crew is gathering. Would you like to join us for game night?
Concord was a AAA multiplayer first-person hero shooter that was released on August 23rd, 2024 on PS5 and PC. In this game, it is your team versus an enemy team. The characters that you and your teammates play have specific roles, such as support, tank, and damage. Your goal is typically to complete objectives in order to... I'm sorry. I'm describing Team Fortress 2 right now. Or maybe I'm describing Overwatch? No, see, I must be thinking about Paladins. No, this is Marvel Rivals, which is going to come out later that year. Do you see what I'm getting at here? Concord was a game that was trying to compete in a heavily saturated game market. You see, the hard part about live service games is getting people to play them. If a player already has a live service game that they enjoy, such as Overwatch or TF2, and you're trying to deliver a game in that same genre, whose niche has been filled for years, you're gonna have a bad time. About a month after their acquisition, Sony dropped a Concord reveal trailer showing, well, to be honest, one of the most high quality burgers I've ever seen. This trailer didn't show any gameplay at all. For about a year, there was radio silence until May 30th, 2024, when Sony dropped both a cinematic and gameplay trailer, to a not great reaction from the internet. Yeah, you'd think Sony and Firewalk would have seen this negative attention that the game was getting, and maybe take it into account. Well, at the very least, they had an upcoming beta for July 12th through the 14th of 2024. It was during this beta that Sony and Firewalk were able to see that nobody wanted to play this game. Saying these beta numbers are bad for a live service game is the understatement of a decade. The wildest part is that Concord was not planning to be free to play. The game was going to cost $40, and the game peaked in the Steam beta at 2,388 players. So why would people spend $40 when they could play Overwatch, or TF2, or Paladins for free? This should have been the final straw for Sony to realize that Firewalk needed to shift directions for the game, or delay it, to do something. But I think the truth of the matter was that it was way past too late. The game was basically finished, both literally and financially. So just go ahead and release it. What's the worst that could happen? August 23rd, 2024. A day that will live in infamy. Concord is released to the public, and despite Sony trying to forcibly shove this game into a saturated market, despite the criticism of both journalists and consumers alike, despite the beta not even breaking 2,500 players, the game peaked at 697 players on Steam. Not even 1,000 players. There is something so incredible about the gaming community unifying to just dump a fat load on a AAA slop game, and it honestly just gives me hope for humanity. This would be known soon as one of the most expensive disasters in gaming history, as multiple sources would claim that the production cost of Concord was somewhere between $200 to $400 million. After only 2 weeks since Concord's release, Sony would proceed to shut the game off on September 6, 2024. A couple months later, Sony announced the shutdown of Firewalk Studios on October 29, 2024, laying off 170 employees. And some people don't know this, but at the same time, Sony shut down another studio called Neon Koi. At the time, Neon Koi were in development of creating a AAA mobile multiplayer action game. Sony shut them down due to, quote, strategic reevaluation and mobile strategy refocus, unquote, which I think is just big corporation speak for the game you're working on probably won't be as profitable as we thought, and we're not focused on the mobile scene as much anymore, so sorry. I genuinely get so upset when I hear about company layoffs because that just means that the upper management is choosing to sacrifice their employees, the ones that actually develop the games, by the way, just so they don't have to lower their overabundant salaries. I will never forget when Nintendo was struggling in the early 2010s with the 3DS and Wii U. Satoru Iwata, the president of Nintendo at the time, took multiple salary cuts, resulting in him losing over 50% of his salary, so that he would not have to lay off his employees. Satoru Iwata was truly a shining and admirable example of how the leader of a company should operate. Rest in peace. Well, thank goodness Sony finally learned through brutal example with Concord that maybe you can't force a live service game to just happen. I'm sure now that Sony will take this knowledge after the incredible blunder that was Concord and put it to good use. Alright, so Sony announces that they are shutting down Bluepoint Games. Now why did they do that? That is a really good question. On September 30th, 2021, Sony Interactive Entertainment announced that they will be acquiring Bluepoint Games. At the time, Bluepoint was on quite a run. The year prior, they had put out the critically acclaimed Demon's Souls remake alongside the launch of the PS5 on November 12, 2020. Bluepoint were also the developers for the Shadow of the Colossus remake on the PS4, which was released on February 6, 2018. With other works such as the Nathan Drake collection, Bluepoint was an obvious choice for Sony to acquire, with their impeccable work for single-player games. So you may or may not find this surprising that the first game that Sony wanted Bluepoint Games to work on was a God of War live service spinoff. Which, alright, okay. God of War was having a big resurgence with the reboot, so I don't think this was necessarily a bad idea. Bluepoint is a competent studio, and God of War has familiar characters and is far more recognizable than whatever Concord was. So okay, let's see how this goes. Yeah, okay, I kind of expected that. Okay, so it looks like Bluepoint has worked on a live service game for basically 4 years and Sony canceled it. Maybe it's time for Sony to have Bluepoint make a single player remake or a remaster, maybe even make their own single player title? That would be cool, right? This decision was greater than or equal to the decision to greenlight Concord. Sony just shut down one of their best studios that they had, after years of making them develop a live service game that they canceled. You cannot make this stuff up. The craziest part was that Bluepoint, allegedly, had gone to Sony to ask to develop a Bloodborne remaster. Can you imagine the game studio that made both the Shadow of the Colossus and Demon Souls remakes making a Bloodborne remake? I would have dollar signs in my eyes if I was a Sony executive. Now in Sony's defense, even though they own the rights to Bloodborne, apparently it was actually From Software that was shutting down the remaster proposal, so not exactly Sony's L here, but definitely an L to shut down the studio. There are other examples of Sony making their studios just switch from game to game. I just want to make the point that Sony, like many other AAA gaming corporations, doesn't seem to know what gamers want or just don't care to listen. Now, it's time to talk about the Bungie-sized elephant in the room. Except, I'm actually not going to be the one to talk about it. For this segment, I brought in my friend, Low-Key Nerd, to give us a look into what was going wrong at Bungie Studios while being under Sony for the past 4 years.
Bungie Studios, under a mix of mismanagement from the top and being under the corporate umbrella of Sony, were put into an impossible place just a short time after its very popular story arc finale with the final shape in 2024. Because it wasn't just the finale of a 10-year story arc, it was the end of a plan that was set in motion more than a decade ago. At this moment, the studio needed to go down a certain path to continue its growth, and obviously they missed that path. On May 21st, 2026, roughly 2 years removed from the final shape release, Bungie announced that Destiny 2's future expansions were being cancelled, with June 9th becoming the game's final live service content update. After that, no more regular content, no more big expansions. Destiny 2 would essentially enter a maintenance mode, and the reaction from the community was, well, let's say a lot of people were very mad.
Oh my God! What is happening right now?
While Destiny's numbers had been dwindling over the last year, mostly in part to a rough set of updates along with a long dry period of basically nothing after a delay of what would have been the next expansion, there was clearly a community here that wanted Destiny. About the same time, Bungie's next game Marathon had been out for a couple of months, and very quickly, the anger was directed at the next target. Now, I don't think it's fair to say that Marathon killed Destiny 2. I think there are years of management decisions, content problems, layoffs, development struggles, and resource allocation that led to this. But the timing made Marathon an incredibly easy villain. So when Destiny got put on life support, and Marathon was still that future, people naturally started asking if they really chose the wrong game. But as Bungie had stated multiple times in the past, was there not a future where both games could exist and be successful? During big gaming showcase streams such as Sony's State of Play and Jeff Keighley's Summer Games Fest, all you could see in the live chats were people spamming, "We want D3." On social media, people were pushing the same message. There were even community efforts encouraging players to show Sony just how many people still cared about Destiny. The message was clear. The community didn't want Destiny to end. They wanted Destiny 3. And Destiny players had their moment to really showcase that love because on June 9th, 2026, Bungie released the final Destiny 2 update, Monument of Triumph. This update brought a number of things to the game that players had been wanting for years. It brought life into all of the content, much of which had been untouched for years because of the natural cycle of loot and making things worth chasing with each new update. The game hit roughly 167,000 concurrent players on Steam, a number on Steam it had not seen in a few years. This peak was nearly double Marathon's peak on Steam, and Marathon had been out only a few months. So you've got Destiny 2, a game that Bungie had just decided was no longer worth continued content development, pulling in a massive player count for its final update. Meanwhile, their future game, Marathon, was struggling to maintain that same level of interest. And that's the part that makes this decision feel so strange, because the community was basically holding up a giant sign saying, "We're still here." Despite the effort of the player base, it probably would have taken much more from the player base to reverse the ending of this game. Because just over 2 weeks later, on June 25th, 2026, Sony announced significant layoffs at Bungie. And these were not random cuts. Sony said the layoffs affected most of the Destiny team, along with some members of the Marathon team. So now the story gets even more depressing. Destiny 2 is ending, the community is begging for Destiny 3. The final update brought in a lot of players, and now the people who actually made Destiny are gone. I have been playing Bungie-made games since I could pick up a controller way back to 2001. They have been creating games and worlds that I have loved since I started playing video games. And to see so many talented developers be removed from their position because of the wrong decisions made at the top levels of the studio and from their corporate overlord, it hurts. I think this is more than just the death of Destiny, but I think it could be the end of Bungie as we know it. No matter what they do from here on out, it will always be met with the anger that the Destiny community holds. And even if they decide to make Destiny again, it has lost so many people who made it so special. It will be Destiny in name, but will it be Destiny in its soul? Now, it's not all bad news from this segment. Project Sunrise is a fan-made project attempting to bring back access to the old vaulted Destiny 2 environments and its content. And what's fascinating is that the community project has demonstrated something Bungie spent years telling us wasn't worth doing. People still want to experience this stuff. They're digging through old content, they're exploring the environments that were removed, finding things that players haven't been able to experience for years. One thing about gamers is if they're passionate enough, they will find a way, and they are doing just that with this fan project. There is an argument to be made that no game should last forever, but the story here is not that Destiny 2 was just getting old. It's the story about mismanagement, because Destiny wasn't some dying franchise that nobody cared about anymore. It was a franchise with a very passionate community that had been beaten down over and over again, but were still showing up when Bungie gave them a reason. The final update proved that. The We Want D3 movement proved that, and things like Project Sunrise are proving that. Unfortunately, Marathon's struggles only make this decision look even more questionable. Maybe Destiny 3 wouldn't reach the highs of the original days of D1 and D2. Maybe if they just kept continuing Destiny 2, it would have continued to fail. Maybe Marathon will eventually turn everything around and become the game of the future. I don't know. But I do know this. Bungie has one of the most dedicated gaming communities on the planet, and despite that dedication, they were told to go home. Because at the end of the day, the people making Destiny weren't the ones making these decisions. To Sony, Destiny wasn't just this world that millions of players had spent years building memories in. It was an investment. It was a business. It was just some numbers on a spreadsheet to them. And when that investment stopped looking like the future they wanted, well, we all know what happened. But that's what makes this ending so frustrating. Because the final update proved that there were still people wanting to be in this world. The players were still here, and they just needed a reason to believe it would continue. And Sony just decided that they weren't worth keeping the door open for. So instead of giving Destiny another chapter, they shut off the lights. And that is one heck of a way to end Destiny.
Currently, it is August 2026. I originally wrote this script back in March 2026, a week after Marathon had come out, and Destiny 2, as far as we knew, was still going to receive expansions and updates. It's crazy how much can change in a few months. I know Low-Key Nerd has talked extensively about Bungie already, but I do want to emphasize that the current state of Bungie is not entirely all of Sony's fault. I think it can even be argued that Bungie can take 100% of the blame. Initially when acquired by Sony, Bungie was able to act independently, and although hindsight is 2020, it wasn't hard to see that Bungie's own poor management and greed got them into the position that they are in today. However, it should still be noted that Sony acquired Bungie in 2022 for $3.6 billion. Since that acquisition, Sony has recorded multiple impairment losses showing that Bungie had not met their expectations. Now, it would be ignorant of me if I didn't include in this video Helldivers 2. Helldivers 2 launched in early 2024, it was an instant hit and still has a healthy player base. However, Sony did come close to killing the game when they tried to force all Helldivers players to link a PSN account. Thankfully, they reversed that decision after getting lots of backlash from the community. Sony still has a couple more live service games in the chamber. Sony back on May 24th, 2023 announced Fair Games, which is being developed by Haven Studios. It is supposed to be a heist competitive shooter, but we've only received a CGI trailer, so I don't have a grasp on how good or bad the game might be. On February 5th, 2026, Sony announced Horizon Hunter's Gathering. At the time of recording this video, Sony has come out with a statement that they are rebooting this game, potentially scrapping the live service part of the game. Even with these games yet to be released, who knows if Sony has the executioner's axe just waiting to strike down on the developers of these games. If we look back at Sony's initial plan, which was to have 12 live service games running under their studio, it is clear that things have not gone as planned for them. But things could still be worse. In my opinion, I think Sony just needs to swap their primary focus from risky live service gambles to single player games once more. After all of these failed games, studio closures, and layoffs, that might be what their plan is. Single player games are easy wins for both their company and players, assuming the games are good. If they're going to pursue live service, they need to listen to their players instead of trying to squeeze every cent out of them. Live service games thrive on consistent communication with their own player bases. Gaming is a passion for many people, and recently a lot of people have been waking up to the type of generic gaming slop that a lot of companies are dishing out. If issues aren't dealt with, and expectations aren't met, people will just stop playing the game. Thank you all for watching, and a big thanks to my friend Lowkey Nerd for covering the Bungie section of this video. I will see you all in the next one.